For this video, we are going to create a class called CLS Student. Inside of that class, we're going to create some variables and some getter and setter functions. In the public side of the class, we are going to create an integer called int class campus ID, just so we can practice working with public variables. We're going to create public functions of a void type for set student name, that's our setter. Get student name, which will return a string, which is our getter. Another function that will be public is get student ID, which is our getter, and set student ID, which is our setter function. Then we're going to have a public function called show student info. Also in the private area, we're going to have some private variables, string variable, str name first, and integer int student ID. We denote that these are private variables by prefixing them with an underscore to help us visualize that these are private variables. For this exercise, we're going to use the class wizard to create our class. So let's see how we can do this. Okay, going to go up and select our project, not the solution, but our project. Left click on it to select it. Right click, go down to class wizard. It's right beneath add. We've been using add up to now, so now we're going one lower to class wizard. Gives you a nice little graphical user interface so we can create our class. Right now you'll see we have no classes in here because we do the drop down, there are no classes listed. But we do have a button that allows us to add a class. So let's click that. Clicking add class, this is where we're going to give it its name, CLS, that's how I like to prefix mine. Student, oops, can't spell. And you'll see it's going to create for us the .h or header file and the .cpp or class source code file. Don't worry about all this other stuff, that's for another semester. Click OK. Now here we have our class, it's created our class. And if we look over in our Solution Explorer, we can see it's created CLS student.h and CLS student.cpp. Now to this we can add some additional stuff. You see we have tabs for command, messages, virtual functions, members, variables, and methods. For our semester, for where we're at, we are only going to be using methods, which are functions, and member variables. So let's start off with some member variables. Click on member variables. So we're going to add some member variables. And we said we're going to create a global variable called int campus ID. And then we're going to create two more that are going to be private. So this one will be public. And these will be private, meaning the private ones cannot be seen outside of the class, whereas the public one can be seen outside of the class. So the private ones are kind of for internal use only within our class. Let's look at this. So I'm going to say we're going to start off with int campus ID. So we're going to come over, we're going to add, we're under the tab for member variables, we're going to click add custom. The data type, if we look, there's a drop down that lets us choose the data type. Now you notice string is not listed, but we can work around that and we'll talk about that in a minute. So we're going to add a variable for, what did we say, campus ID. So int campus ID, int campus ID within the naming conventions for our class. This will be a public variable. You notice that we have public, protected, and private. For the purposes of our semester, we will only be working with the public and the private. So we're going to leave this one as public because we want that one to be seen outside of the class. Click OK. You see it has created your variable. Now we're going to add some private variables. So let's look at our code again. So we're going to add private variables for string, for underscore str first name, and underscore int student ID. So let's start off with student ID. So that's an integer, int student ID. Now we said we want this to be a private variable, so we're going to prefix it with an underscore to remind us that that's a private variable within the naming conventions. We're going to select the access modifier of private, and we're going to click OK. We now have listed in our little member variables list underscore int student ID. And we said we also need to create str name first. So let's look at that. Matter of fact, I'm going to copy that right there. Again, we're going to put an underscore in front of it to remind us it's a private variable as well. So we're going to add another custom variable. Now this is a string, and we said we notice string is not in the list. But you do notice you can type in here. So we're going to type string in and realize that we have to add the string header to our class header file so we can include strings. But for now, just go ahead and type it in. Make sure you spell it correctly. string. Then we're going to put our variable in here. Underscore str name first. And we said this is going to be a private variable. So we select the access modifier of private. Click OK. So we have one public variable and two private variables. All right. As we're going along, it will start writing code for us in the background. We can actually peek over at it, but we're going to wait on that. So now we want to create some setters for set student name, and we're going to pass in a variable for holding the student name. So I'm going to do setters and getters for student name. So let's look at how we can do this. So we're going to go over to the tab for methods. Methods are functions. So we select methods. You notice there are none currently listed. I can go back to see, and I still see my variables there, but if I go back to methods, now I can add some functions. So we're going to add a function. Now if it gives you an error here, I'll show you how you can fix this in just a second. So we're going to do get student name. Return type, in this case, it's going to return a string. Well, string again is not listed, but we can type that in there. string. Click OK. If it gives you an error like that, what it's telling you is it can't find the path to your CPP file for some reason. This does come up. So we're going to click Apply. So if you get that error when you try to add a method, I'll show you how to fix that. Now you notice our changes for our variables are still there, but you may need to undo your functions for a minute. We're going to click OK. You notice when we click OK, when we open up the CLS student header file, that our entries that we created for the variables are in there. You can already see they're showing the public access modifier and the private access modifier. It's giving us an error on string, but again, we know we have to include the header file for string, but we'll do that in a minute. But let's fix this other problem to begin with. So I'm going to right click on my tab for where my header file is located, or I could even use the source CPP file. I'm going to copy this path, select copy. That's where my source code is located. Most particularly what we're looking for is my clsstudent.cpp file, so we can fix this error that comes up sometimes. So I'm going to run my source code, class wizard again. So go down to class wizard. And I notice when I'm trying to do this, we're going to add that function back again. Let's do function name is lowercase get student. Let's do ID this time. ID. That will return an integer, so that's fine. That is going to be a public method, so we drop down the list. We have the same three access modifiers for our function. We want this to be public. But what is missing is it doesn't know where to find our CPP file. So this comes up sometimes. So click the little triple dots for the wizard next to the CPP file. In there, make sure you put in the path or browse to where your source code is at. And locate that student CPP CLS student.cpp file or your class source code file, whatever it may be named. Click Save. Now that that is in there, this should work just fine. So we're going to leave this. So we have the name of our function, the return type, the access modifier of public in this case. You can even include a comment. The getter function for student ID. This will save you a little time on coding. Click OK, and there we have our function, this time with no error message. So let's look at some other functions we need to add. So we've got in this case we've got a getter for our student ID, so let's add a setter. So here we're going to do a set in lowercase student ID, This is also going to be, well, we're setting it so we're not returning any type, so this will be a void, and void is listed, so we select void. This also will be a public function. We can put a comment in here. This is the setter, or excuse me, setter function for student ID. Click OK. So we have a getter and a setter function because we don't want to expose that internal variable, so we need setter and getter functions. Similarly, we're going to need some for the oops, I nearly forgot something. We'll fix that on the next one. We're going to do one for the student name. So we're going to get student name. Now if we're getting it, in this case it'll be a string, and we notice again that string is not listed as a type, but we can type it in. So we're going to type in string, knowing that we have to make sure we include the class header file for string later on. This will be public as well, going into the correct file. Now what we didn't do when we did the getter a while ago, we forgot something, so we're going to fix it with this one, and we'll do the other one, we'll fix it manually. But let's put in our comment. We're going to, this is the getter function for student name. You notice we have this box for parameters, so we can add parameters, that's stuff inside the parentheses on our functions. Let's click a plus. What are we going to add here? Let's see. Well, we're clearly going to be doing something with a student name, but since this is a getter, it doesn't need any parameters coming in, so this will be blank. So we're going to leave this blank, but when we do the setter for student name, we're going to have to do some additional input. So let's click OK. There's our getter function for student name. Now let's do our setter function for student name. We're going to add another method. We're going to do set student name. Alright, it's going to be a void type because it's not going to return anything. We're just setting the student name, but we're going to use a variable in here. The variable we're going to use is that private variable, we are a variable to receive that. So we're going to create str student name, or str name last, name first. We're going to leave that parameter in there, and we're going to add our comment. This is the setter function for the student name, and in this class we're probably going to concentrate just on the first name for this example. Click OK. If you get an error, be sure to include the data type. So we're going to edit this. We're going to include a data type of string. And click OK. Now we have our string parameter that is going inside the parentheses for str name first. See, we pause for a second. Look over what we have created so far. So far we have some custom variables. We have a public variable called int campus ID, and we have two private variables that we also additionally annotate by including the underscore in front of the variable name. We have created methods for getters and setters for student ID. Let's create one more function. So we're going to add another method. This one's just going to display all of the information we have created up to now. We're going to call this function name show student info, and this again will be a void data type. This will be a public access modifier. This function will display the student name and student ID. So we're going to have this for our option there. We're not going to pass any parameters in. We're going to click OK. Now as we look at our work, we realize that we have made one slight mistake here. When we were creating our function for Our setter for student name, we made sure to pass in a parameter, but we forgot to include a parameter for student ID. So we're going to correct that. We'll correct that in code in just a second. You can double click or go to definition or go to declaration, and that will take you there, but I just want you to see it directly from the file itself. So if I needed to add something else, I could add more. If I needed to add more variables, I could add more. So let's look at what all this has done for us. We click OK, and once we do, we can open up the student.h file, for example, that it generated, and we see that it has been going through and it's made several public sections and a private section. Well, that's kind of messy. The private section, again, are the stuff that is only accessible within the class, and the public is that which is accessible by anything outside of the class. Well, we need to clean this up. The wizard does a good job, but there is just some cleanup you still wind up doing. So we're going to come down here so we don't have two different public sections. We're going to highlight this one line and move it down to the other public area and get rid of the duplicated entry. So we have now one private and one public section. We also notice it's fussing about string. Well, that's because we need to make some other adjustments here. For the purposes of our class, we do not use the progma once. That is a Microsoft specific standard. So we're going to do something a little more closer to a universal standard. So we're going to change that # progma to if not defined. There we go. If not defined. And it gives us a little autocomplete there where we can put in stuff. So now we're going to put in a tag to identify this test for what code we're looking for. This is to deduplicate the inclusion of this class if we happen to reference it more than one time in a program. So here we do give it a tag of some kind. I like to just name it after the class itself, student _h. There are a lot of different standards. We arrow down, you notice it auto fills in the tag here. So what we're saying is if this has not been previously defined when we include it, then we're going to do what's inside of this if end if. We want to do a define, and we'll use again the same tag, student _h, and within that, if it's not been defined, it will define the code. So the code we want to define is our class. So we're going to move all of this up inside this if not defined define. So in the define section it says define this. If it is not previously defined, define it. Now you notice it is also still fussing about the string. So let's fix that now. Matter of fact, we're going to go ahead and do a couple other things. So within the define section, I'm going to do a # include string. We should hopefully see our error go away here in a minute. We're also going to use, using namespace std. Now all should be right with the world. We notice the error message goes away for our string. So we now can use the string class and directly reference it. We also know that we're going to be doing some console input and output, so let's go ahead and include in our header file our IO stream. Now these are very similar to what we've been doing in our source CPP file. And we're going to show you how you can clean that up a little bit in a minute too. But when we look at our our class.h file, we have now included these. When we look at our class source code file, the cls student.cpp file, you'll notice that it includes everything that's in the class or cls student.h file or the class header file. So that means by default it gets string include, it gets iostream include, and namespace using. So all of that is now available within your class source code file. Let's go back and look at what all it created again. Now we did say we had one mistake we made. When we created the setter for student name, we created it and we passed in a parameter. Let me clean this up so it's a little more readable. So we're going to space that out, and we're going to space this out. So these are the setters and getters for student ID. These are the setters and getters for student name, and this is our show function that we're going to do to show all that information. And here's our public variable called campus ID. Okay, so now we're going to make our first changes using those private variables. So we're working with student ID, so we're going to work with the variable underscore int student ID. We're going to go over to our class source code file, which is the one that ends in CPP. It was nice and generated for us these little remarks to remind us we need to replace stuff. Well, in this one, now you can put a lot of code in here of you doing things, but we're not actually processing anything. In this case, we're just returning the student ID number. So we can get rid of that comment. Oops, over-typed, over-deleted. Now you notice it also was nice and generated for us a return 0, but in this case we really want to return the student ID. Well, that student ID is going to be stored in that private variable. So underscore int student ID. There we go. So the whole purpose of this one little function is to return the student ID. Let's go down to the setter function for student ID. So we're going to pass in, when we call this function, a student ID that we want to store in that private variable, underscore int student ID. So let's replace this code here. Now this is a void return function, but we are still going to put a return here because we're good little programmers. And above that return, we are going to set that private variable value. So int underscore int student ID. We're going to assign it to the variable we passed into the function called student ID, which is just a temporary variable declared within that function. So int student ID, put our semicolon, and we have now completed both our setter and our getter functions for student ID. So let's do the same thing for student name. Okay, student name is a string. You notice it put in a suggestion here for us. Obviously that's not going to work for us. What we're going to return is that private variable value that holds the name of the student's first name. So we're going to do an underscore str, what did we call it? See, student name, str name first. There we go. Sorry. So that's all this is going to do. We could have other stuff going on in there, but that's really all this function needs to do in this case. We come down to set student name. We're going to pass in a string value. It's going to be stored in this temporary variable called str first name. So let's put in our code here because we want to update our private variable underscore str student, or excuse me, name first. And we're going to give it a value of the variable we passed in, str name first. And that is all that function has to do. But we do want to be good little programmers, even though it's a return or void, we're going to put in our return as well. So there we have completed our setters and getters for student name. Lastly, we're going to display some values. So we want to use our function called showStudent to display some output. Now again, it gave us a remark that we're going to remove just there to remind us. So we're going to remove that remark. So we're going to start off by clearing our screen. We're going to do a cout. We're going to say your student's first name is, and we're going to use our private variable, the one that is not exposed outside of the class, str name first. Oops, wrong thing. str name first. There we go. Include our end line, or endl. We're going to do another cout. Your student's ID number is, and again we're going to use the private variable that we created, one that is not exposed outside of the class, for holding the student ID number. Let's see, student ID number and L. We also want to show our campus ID, which is the publicly exposed variable, just so that you can see, yes, you can actually work directly with that. Your campus ID number is, and that is a public variable, so we just use it without the underscore. Int campus ID and L. Do our system pause, just to pause our output. Do our return, even though this is a void function, and all is happy. So looking at what we've created setters and getters for the class ID, student ID, and then the student name. And then we have created a public function that is going to display all of that information. Now let's look at how we can use this in our program. So far we have created a class, we've given it a name, we've created some private and public attributes, in this case a couple of private variables and a couple of public functions and variables. We've gone into our class source code file. Within there we've given them things that they can do, so we put code within what those class definitions have, so we're doing stuff. But now over in our source CPP file, we haven't actually used any of that class, because if I run my code, it'll run, but it won't do anything because there's not doing anything at all with the class. That's all it does. So let's make an adjustment. Let's actually use it. So we're going to go down to the initialize section. Well, the name of our class is CLS student. Oh wait, it's not recognizing it. Why? Doesn't find it. When we start trying to use it, it says okay, fine, but I don't know what that is. That is because we haven't included the header file for our class. So let's get rid of that. We're going to come back up here. Well, we included stuff for IOStream and string and so forth, but we didn't include our class header file. So we're going to do #include. Now normally we do the greater than or less than. That means that those libraries or headers or files are located within the file paths that are known to Visual Studio. However, this class that we've created is not within that path. It's where our program lives, in a completely different location. So we're going to access that by using the double quotes. Once we do double quotes, you notice it says, oh, okay, I'm looking where your program is, and I see you've got a class header file there. Is that what you want to use? And in fact, that is. So we'll select it. And we have now included our class here in our code for our source.cpp, or our main function. So now when we come down to try to initialize it, it says, let's try it again, CLS student. There it is. It recognizes it immediately. And we can use that like we use any data type, like we're using an int, a float, or whatever. That is a data type, that class is. So we're going to create an object based on that class, and I'm going to call it CLS stu. Not a very appropriate name, but we're going to use it for this lecture example, and put a semicolon. So I have now instantiated or created an instance of that class. So we can now actually start using it. And to test that, we're going to come down, and we don't actually, we do have some inputs, so let's see what we do, how we use it. So we're going to do CLS stu. That is our object based on that class. We do the dot operator. Once we do the dot operator, we notice we can get to student ID. That's the public function for student ID, getters and setters, and the student name public functions for getters and setters. Our campus ID, which is a public variable, but you notice we don't see the underscore variables, meaning the private variables that we define. Because again, they're only available or visible within the class. We're trying to protect them a little bit. So what we're going to do, we're going to set a student ID. So we're going to look for our student ID setter. We're going to assign it a value. It's a function, so it has parentheses. Inside of that function, it takes an integer value, and we of course need to end it with a semicolon. If I had any questions about what it was, I could hover over it, and I can see by the little tooltip that pops up that it's expecting an integer for an input, and that is part of the student class. So now let's set the student name, CLS stu dot. Now we know I've got a setter function for that. So setter function for the student name. It's a function, so I'm going to do parentheses. Inside there I can pass in a string, and again I can confirm that by hovering over it. You'll see that it expects a string inside the parentheses in the little pop-up. Inside there I'm going to say my name is James. Okay. Let's set our campus ID. CLS stu dot campus ID. Well, campus ID, that is a public variable, which means I can directly access that. It is usually a bad idea because you're exposing your underlying data. But in this case, to illustrate working with a public variable, we're going to do it. Normally you would do setters and getters though, but we're going to update the campus ID variable value directly. So that's a variable, that's a property of that class, that's an integer value. We're going to say we're at campus 55, or 555, excuse me. Now we've got all that information. In theory we've input it, so let's go down. We really don't have any processing for this, so we're going to go down to the output section, and we're going to use our class again, our class object again, CLS stu dot, and we can show the value. So here's show student info, select that, and that's a function. So again, we do parentheses. It's a void function with no parameters, so it means it returns nothing. Again, we can hover over it to see that it's a void function, returns nothing and expects nothing inside the parentheses. So this should show us the student information. So I'm going to save our code. Looking through, let me close my output window for a second and scroll through. Now, one other comment I have for you. You know, we said when we included in the H file, we included the IO stream and the string and the namespace using. So if we go over there, we can double check that. So at the top, we have IO stream. Let me bring that down a little bit. We said that we had included in our header file, our H file for our class, we've included string and IO stream as well as namespace using. Well, if the header file is also included in our source file, so we go back over to our source CPP file, we see that we've included it. Well, if this has these two, we really don't need them here anymore. So we can actually remove them from here and we will work just fine because they've been included as part of our class file. So let's run our code and see what it looks like. And we should see that the student's first name is James, the student's ID number is 1001, campus ID is 555. All of these values coming from our setters and getters and our public function for show student info in our class. And that is creating classes with the wizard the easy way. Again, all of this we could have done manually by typing in all of the same code just by doing right click, add new item to our project, and you notice you have the option to add the header file and the class source code file. Could have done both of those by just adding each of those items and then typing in the very same entries that we have in here. But I think you'll find that working with the wizard, which again we can always go back, right click on our project, select class wizard, and we're right back to where we can use that wizard again with our code. That being said, that is the basics of using the class wizard to create your classes, edit codes, correct mistakes within the codes, and if it can't find the class source code file when you're creating using the class wizard. Again, don't forget in your class header file to get rid of the progma entry and replace it with the # if not defined in a tag, define, and then at the bottom below all of your code, below the last semicolon, the end if with the same tag. Don't forget and accidentally erase your semicolon there. That is important. One other thing I forgot to demonstrate, let's go back over to our class source file. By the way, you'll notice I've also removed the namespace using because it is again included in our header file for our class, so we don't need it. But we use the setters in our input area here from lines 24 to 27, but I never demonstrated using those getters. So let's look at those. So here we're going to do another little cout. And we're going to use those getters from our class. Oops. Class. Let me add a little bit more here real quick. And add our end line. Now we did use earlier in the lines above, we used the or in the lines below, we're going to use the code for our, move that down, it's in the wrong place. Clean this up a little bit here. So now we're actually going to use our getters individually, so you can see that they actually work as well. So we're going to use our class object, stu dot, we're going to use get student ID. It's a function. It's going to do return, so we need to do a cout getter for student ID at our inline. We're going to use the same thing for our student name, so let's do cout getter for student name, and again we access our object we instantiated for the class. We do a dot operator. We can do the getter for student name. It's a function, so we do parentheses. We do our end L, and we should be able to test our code. And we should now not only see the information coming from the function we created in our class called show student info, but we should be able to see also using the individual getters for student ID and student name. So let's run our code, see what that looks like. And there we have our getters for the getter usage for the student ID, and our getter, whoops, with a typo, it should be 2 T's there, our getter for the student name.